open it up to questions.
Thank you. To ask a question, you may press star and one. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, that's star and one to ask a question. And today's first question comes from Pete Williams with NBC News. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. Washington, D.C. has a lot of experience in dealing with large, complex events that include protests like the inauguration or meetings of the World Bank. Why did you think it was necessary for you to take command of this, and where does that authority come from?
Well, I think the rioting got going, I think, on Friday, May 29th, and got worse and worse over the weekend. It culminated or came to a crescendo over the weekend on Sunday evening right around the White House on H Street on the northern side of Lafayette Park. And it was very serious rioting. The Treasury Department annex there was broken into. A historical building on Lafayette Park, which is federal property, was burned down. There was a fire set at the historical St. John's Church right there across from the White House, and an old church that goes back to the 18th century and is referred to as the Church of Presidents. The rioters used crowbars to dig out the pavers at Lafayette Park and use them as projectiles thrown at Secret Service and other federal agents. There were numerous head injuries among the federal personnel whose responsibility is to protect the White House. Just to give you an indication, but from Saturday until today, and virtually, the lion's share of these injuries came over the weekend, there were 114 injuries to law enforcement, most of those to federal agents, and most of those inflicted right around the White House. There were 22 hospitalizations, and most of those were serious head injuries or concussions that required monitoring and treatment. On Monday, the president asked me to coordinate the various federal law enforcement agencies, not only the multiple Department of Justice agencies, but also other agencies such as those in the Department of Homeland Security. So we had a coordinated response and worked with the National Guard and also with the DC police. That morning, we decided that we needed more of a buffer to protect the White House and to protect our agents and Secret Service personnel who could be reached by projectiles from H Street. I made the decision that we would try to move our perimeter northward by a block to provide this additional protection. And later at 2 o'clock on Monday, I met with all the various law enforcement agencies, and we set our tactical plan. And that plan involved moving our perimeter a block north to I Street. It was our hope to be able to do that relatively quickly before many demonstrators appeared that day. Unfortunately, because of the difficulty in getting appropriate forces and units into place, by the time they were able to move our perimeter up to I Street, there had been a large number of protesters had assembled on H Street. There were projectiles being thrown, and the group was becoming increasingly unruly, and the operation, they were asked 3 times if they would move back 1 block. They refused, and we proceeded to move our perimeter out to I Street. It is true that the Metropolitan Police have a lot of experience in dealing with demonstrations, but we have a lot of federal this is the federal city. It's the seat of the federal government. Many of the buildings, as you know, and facilities here and the monuments are the responsibility of the federal government, and the proceedings and process of the federal government take place here. And so when you have a large-scale civil disturbance that is damaging federal property, threatening federal property, threatening federal law enforcement officers, threatening the officials in government and their offices, and our great monuments, it is the responsibility of the federal government to render that protection, and we do so in close coordination with the Metropolitan Police Department. Fortunately, later that evening on Monday, after we did establish a buffer zone, we were able to finish that day without further significant violence from the demonstrators. And then the following 2 days were peaceful. The assemblies and the protests were peaceful. So we're pleased with that. We're working closely with the Metropolitan Police to plan out the remainder of the week. Next question.
Our next question comes from Pierre Thomas with ABC News. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Attorney General Barr. A couple of very good questions for you, if I may. Yesterday, the department charged 3 members of the group, or associated with the group Boogaloo, a far-right extremist group, known as a far-right extremist group. Is it important in your remarks and thoughts to point out all the different groups that are involved in this type of violent activity? And then the second question is, do you have any concerns that law enforcement could have perhaps been more surgical in how they operated on Monday? And many of the people who were moved forcibly were peaceful protesters, sir.
Well, I do think it's important to point out the witch's brew that we have of extremist individuals and groups that are involved, and that's why in my prepared statement I specifically said, in addition to Antifa and other extremist groups like Antifa, there are a variety of groups and people of a variety of ideological persuasions. So I did make that point. I'm not going to get too specific, but the intelligence being collected by our U.S. Attorney's Office, particularly integrated by the FBI from multiple different sources, is building up. There are some specific cases against individuals, some Antifa related. A lot of the extremists are involved in egging on violence and participating in violence, providing the means of violence, and we are pursuing those cases. At the same time, there's a lot of, I would also add, there's a lot of disinformation out there, people posing as different, as they're members of the different groups, so you sometimes have to dig a little deeper to determine exactly what's going on. There are some groups that don't have a particular ideology other than anarchy. There are some groups that want to bring about a civil war, the Boogaloo group, that has been on the margin of this as well, trying to exacerbate the violence. So we are dealing with, as I say, a witch's brew of a lot of different extremist organizations. Maybe Chris would have something to add to that.
Sure. I mean, let me say first, as I've said for quite some time, and including even my first few months in the job, we, the FBI, have quite a number of ongoing investigations of violent anarchist extremists, including those motivated by an Antifa or Antifa-like ideology, and we categorize and treat those as domestic terrorism investigations and are actively pursuing them through our joint terrorism task forces. In the course of the current unrest, while the majority of the protesters are peaceful, there are certainly instigators, agitators, and opportunists seeking to exploit these demonstrations to commit violence or rioting. And exactly who these people are, who's driving them, what tactics they use, varies widely sometimes from city to city, sometimes even from night to night. And we're working with all of our law enforcement partners to gather as much information as we can about that topic and to bring federal charges where appropriate and possible. So we're about the violence. We're not about the ideology. And it doesn't matter what your ideology is. If you commit violence or rioting or acts that we would consider terrorism, we're going to pursue it.
The second part of your question, Pierre, I mean, one of the difficulties is that while there are peaceful demonstrators and participants in these protests, it is the instigators, those committed to violence, basically shield themselves by going among them and carrying out acts of violence. Those projectiles, I saw the projectiles on Monday when I went to Lafayette Park to look at the situation, and as one of the officials said, that he pointed out various knots of people where the projectiles were coming from, and we could see, and it was a lot of demonstrators, and it's hard to know exactly where they're coming from. Frequently, these things are thrown from the rear of the demonstration. But we could not continue to protect the federal property involved and protect the safety of our agents with such a tight perimeter. And so our object was to move it out by one block. The next question, please.
Our next question comes from David Spunk with Fox News. Please go ahead.
Hello, Mr. Attorney General. Yesterday, your colleague over at the Department of Defense, Secretary Esper, expressed some regret in the way that things were handled at Lafayette Park, Lafayette Square, posing in a picture with President Trump, said he wants to stay apolitical, stay out of things. As you mentioned, you had this job in 1992. You saw this during the Rodney King riots. What do you think about politics, and do you believe that you're being too political in this by standing in a picture with the president in front of the church? What is your take on this compared to what Secretary Esper said?
Yeah, I don't know what he was conveying there. Obviously, my interest was to carry out the law enforcement functions of the federal government and to protect federal facilities and federal personnel, and also to address the rioting that was interfering with the government's function. And that was what we were doing. I think the president is the head of the executive branch and the chief executive of the nation, and should be able to walk outside the White House and walk across the street to the Church of Presidents. I don't necessarily view that as a political act. I think it was entirely appropriate for him to do. I did not know that he was going to do that until later in the day, after our plans were well underway to move the perimeter. So there was no correlation between our tactical plan of moving the perimeter out by one block and the president's going over to the church. The president asked members of his cabinet to go over there with him, the two that were present, and I think it was appropriate for us to go over with him. Next question.
Thank you, sir. Our next question comes from Mike Balsamo with the Associated Press. Please go.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. Can you expand a little bit on your comments that foreign actors are responsible or working to exploit all sides here? And do you believe that's an organized disinformation effort from a foreign government? And have you identified, which countries are responsible for that? And then I have a separate question for Director Carvajal, if I could, right after that.
Okay. I may ask Chris if he cares to provide a little more detail. I'm not sure how much detail we want to get into, but people shouldn't think that countries that are hostile to the United States, that their efforts to influence the U.S. or weaken the U.S. or sow discord in the U.S. is something that comes and goes with the election cycle. It is constant. And they are constantly trying to sow discord among our people. And there's a lot of disinformation that circulates that way. And I believe that we have evidence that some of the foreign hackers and groups that are associated with foreign governments are focusing in on this particular situation we have here and trying to exacerbate it in every way they can. Unless Chris has something to add, I can turn it over to, yeah.
Not a whole lot that I can say here, other than to say that it is unfortunately not unusual for foreign actors to choose to try to amplify events in this country to sow divisiveness and discord, and in particular through the use of state-associated media from some of those countries, but also social media provides a bullhorn or an amplifier to gin up more controversy where controversy may already exist, and to try to generate upheaval in that regard. And those foreign actors should know that we're watching it extremely closely and are prepared to act if necessary.
And what's your question for Mr. Carvajal?
Director, can you address some concerns that have been raised in the last few days about the BOP, specifically that some officers stationed around D.C. Have said that they've been specifically told not to tell people that they work for the federal government? And last night we learned an inmate at the MDC in Brooklyn had died after officers used pepper spray on him after he barricaded himself. Do you have concerns there that non-lethal force resulted in someone's death?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mike, for the question. And let me clarify this. First of all, I'm not aware of any specific Bureau of Prisons personnel being told not to identify themselves. What I attribute that to is probably the fact that we normally operate within the confines of our institution and we don't need to identify ourselves. Most of our identification is institution specific and probably wouldn't mean a whole lot to people in D.C. I probably should have done a better job of marking them nationally as the agency. Point is well taken, but I assure you that no one was specifically told, to my knowledge, not to identify themselves. As for your question regarding the incident at MDC Brooklyn, what I can tell you, we did do a press release with the information in there. It was, as you stated, an incident involving a disruptive individual down in a cell. The officers did utilize pepper spray, as you say, OC, and afterwards the individual unfortunately died. What I will tell you is that we immediately referred the case to the FBI and the Office of Inspector General. I was actually notified this morning that the Officer Inspector General is going to take that case. And that's about all I can comment on because the matter is under investigation.
Let me just add that the Bureau of Prisons SORT teams are used frequently for emergency response and in emergency situations and either civil disturbances or hurricanes or other things like that. They are highly trained units, and in fact, In the Department of Justice, we do not really have large numbers of units that are trained to deal with civil disturbances. I know a lot of people maybe looking back on history think we can call on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of U.S. Marshals, and that's simply not the case. Our Marshals response force is approximately 100 U.S. Marshals. And so historically, when there have been emergencies where we have to respond with people who do have experience in these kinds of emergencies, they're highly trained people. We use what are called SORT teams, response teams from the Bureau of Prisons. And I could see a number of, now in the federal system, we don't wear badges with our name. I mean, the agents don't wear badges in their names and stuff like that, which many civilian police agents, non-federal police agencies do. I could understand why some of these individuals simply wouldn't want to talk to people about who they are, if that in fact was the case. I'll take the next question.
Our next question comes from Sadie Gurman with Wall Street Journal. Please go ahead. Sadie, your line is open now.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi there. Hoping you can explain how exactly you coordinate the National Guard deployment and movements in and around Washington with those of various federal law enforcement agencies. Is it you who communicates the orders to them, and how does that work?
No, well, it largely depends who they're supporting at that time. Some of the National Guard were supporting the Metropolitan Police Department, and some of them would be out beyond the White House perimeter, working the streets with MPD. So they would be tactically attached there. Others, we asked the National Guard to protect federal monuments, and so a number of the units, maybe even, well, I won't speculate about a majority, but a lot of the units were dispersed around the city to protect federal monuments or particular federal facilities. Those that were within the White House area and were part of protecting the White House and Lafayette Park area were under the direction of the tactical commanders in that area. But in terms of requesting the resources and asking for their assistance, that was ultimately my responsibility of ensuring that the National Guard that we needed to support law enforcement and support the district were brought to bear. Next question.
Yes, sir. Our next question comes from Katie Benner with New York Times. Please go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Attorney General. Thank you so much for doing this press conference. I have two questions, but the most important is probably I'd like to ask you about your thoughts on police abuse of power. Last year at a law enforcement conference, you said that such abuse reflected bad apples more than systemic breakdowns. But today you said George Floyd's death is not the first of its kind. While the vast majority of officers do their jobs bravely and righteously, it's undeniable that many African Americans lack confidence in the criminal justice system. So has your thinking on whether we're looking at a systemic issue or not shifted over time?
No, my views haven't shifted recently. And what you quoted, I think is consistent. And you were addressing, the use of excessive force. Is that right, Katie? Is that what you were addressing, or were you talking more?
Yes, excessive force, the police abuse. Yes.
Yeah, I do think that those who engage in excessive force that involves, remember, federal civil rights laws address willful use of excessive force, and those that engage in that kind of activity, I think, are a distinct minority. And I think the overwhelming number of police officers try conscientiously to use appropriate and reasonable force.
And then my second question was just, it seems that we're ratcheting up in the district the tools and the power of the federal response, giving DEA, BOP, for example, the power to make arrests. I'm wondering why that's happening now, because it seems that the streets have been relatively calm and there's no curfew tonight. And I think that decision was made by the mayor because she has confidence that we've sort of returned to order.
Well, actually, after assessing the situation last night toward the end of the evening, that is late in, or maybe early in the morning, I felt that we could afford to collapse our perimeter and eliminate some of the checkpoints and so forth, and take a little bit of a more low-profile footprint for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think that we have seen a sharp reduction in violent episodes and peaceful demonstrations, and our hope and expectation is that those will continue. And also because we now have on hand sufficient resources, we feel, to deal with that contingency if violence increases. So I do think that over the weekend, and certainly at the beginning of this week, we had a phenomenon around the country with a number of cities getting extremely violent. A lot of officers have been hurt around the country, a lot of victims, a lot of property damage. And as I said, on Sunday, it was probably the peak of violence in D.C., and on Monday, we were still facing very large demonstrations that were belligerent and throwing projectiles, although the evening ultimately ended more peaceably. So as I told the governors on Monday, it's very important to use sufficient forces, law enforcement, to establish law and order in a city when you have riots running. If you use insufficient resources, it's dangerous for everybody. It's dangerous for the officers, it's dangerous for the protesters, it's dangerous for the population. Because things can easily get out of control and you lose control of events. That's what riots are. And the way to address it is to make sure the resources are there and that people understand the resources are there to deal with that kind of violence. And I think once that occurred, it provided an environment where things could quiet down, and they did quiet down, and hopefully they will stay quieted down. Next. Okay. I think that was it. I appreciate everyone's attendance. And I again want to appreciate the hard work done by all the men and women in the Department of Justice and the Justice Department components and their leaders. Thank you.
We will make America great again.